Awesome. Oh, guys, that was so great. So next, I'm going to bring up to the screen my friend. Everyone's my friend. We're not going to go through this again this year. Alessandra Casiello, who was on the Teen Book Selection Committee, who is going to be introducing our next speaker, who is here with us, Samira Ahmed. I'm so excited. I get to gush now off screen. So Alessandra, take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim. Yes, and I get to gush on screen now. I am so excited to introduce our next author and to have them speak about this specific book, but also about all of the books that they've done, because I've read them all and they are incredible and amazing. Samira Ahmed is the best-selling author of Love, Hate, and Other Filters, Internment, Mad, Bad, and Dangerous to Know, Hollow Fires, and the Amira and Hamza middle grade duology, as well as a Miss Marvel comic book miniseries. Her poetry, essays, and short stories have appeared in numerous publications and anthologies, including the New York Times, Take the Mic, Color Outside the Lines, Vampires Never Get Old, and A Universe of Wishes. She was born in Bombay, India, and grew up in Batavia, Illinois, in a house that smelled like fried onions, spices, and potpourri. A graduate of the University of Chicago, Samira has taught high school English in both the suburbs of Chicago and New York City, worked in education nonprofits, and spent time on the road for political campaigns. When she's not reading or writing, she can be found on her lifelong quest for the perfect pastry, which I also think everybody here appreciates and understands. So with that, I am so happy to say welcome to Samira Ahmed, and I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, Alessandra. Thanks so much for that lovely introduction. And hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I just want to start off by saying I'm just so honored that Hollow Fires is the teen selection for all CT reads. That's truly amazing because there's so many great YA books out right now. And I just want to say thank you. And, you know, there's already been a little bit of talk about this on here before, but libraries have meant so much to me. Growing up as a kid in my small town of Batavia, Illinois, we were the first Indian family to live in the town. And, you know, we were new immigrants. We were one of the only immigrant families. And the library was more than just like a safe space, just a place where I could go hang out. I did the summer reading club every year. And it was just very, very important to me. In fact, one of the very first pieces that I ever had published was about my relationship to libraries in a collection of essays, an anthology called This Is What a Librarian Looks Like. And so libraries mean so much to me. And when I was an undergrad, I was work study and I worked in the library. I worked in special collections. So I was a page, but I also got to work in a book preservation lab. So I am a library geek, like in my bones. So this really just, I'm very honored. The selection means so much to me. So thanks. What I thought I would do is read a little bit of Hollow Fires, talk a little bit about sort of some of the things that run through my books and maybe some of the inspiration behind Hollow Fires. And I want to make sure we have time for questions. So just jump in. What time should we do for questions?
Absolutely. I guess we could stop around 5:53-ish.
Yes, perfect. Perfect.
And take some questions then.
Okay, that sounds good. So I'm going to first just start by talking a little bit about my sort of writer experience. Now, one thing I always say one thing I always talk about when I go, especially to schools, is, you know, I ask everyone this question, like, who was asked as a kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? Every single person on earth has been asked this. And when I was a kid, my answers were ballerina, tennis player, and doctor. So I did not become any of those things, but all of those things were sort of like part of the bedrock of what, you know, eventually led me into my writing life. And I am thankful that I have many, many experiences that led me to here. I spent a long time as a high school English teacher, and I worked in education reform. I helped build new high schools. I was a lobbyist for education funding. But so much of my education experience centered around teens and high schools. And I absolutely love that age so much. I think teens, especially the readers that I'm writing for right now, Gen Z, are truly incredible. They're inspiring. And I always say, I know there's the phrase of like, they're the future, but I always think like that's actually not accurate, because these young people are also our today. And so I kind of write to honor their stories. And, that's just really important to me. So young people are my inspiration. My former students are my inspiration. And all these young people that I meet, whether it's in school visits or even just like my neighborhood, like when I'm going to my local bookstore, these are the people whose stories inspire me. Their courage inspires me. And I always call this age that I'm writing in, that young adult age, the realm of possibility, because you're really on that cusp between, childhood and adulthood. And I always think of it as, just visually, I imagine it as kind of this space where there's all these doors, and young people are looking at all these doors and they're invited to open them, to journey down one of them. And some of those doors are going to be blocked. Some of them, are going to be really hard to open. Sometimes kids are going to be opening a door and they look down that path and they're like, oh, I really don't want to go down that path. But so I feel like this is just such an interesting space to write for. It's a space of natural conflict, also, especially with parents and the adult figures in your life, because, ultimately the job of a parent is to, give their child everything they need to be fully independent. And the age of teenagers is that time where they're like, okay, now I have my independence and I'm moving away. And that's usually when like parents and the adults around them are like, no, we're trying to hold you back a little bit because we don't want you to, get away yet. And so I think that causes an interesting natural friction. And so much of all of that space, that realm, is what I write my stories into. It's a space where young people are finding their voices and they're finding their politics. And so often, and in virtually all of my books, I write about times in childhood, where part of childhood is shattered because of decisions that adults have made, because of societal, because of societal forces that young people not only can't control, but because they are young, have not really been able to yet influence. And I feel so often, and it's so unfair, that our kids are forced to find their courage because of these decisions that adults are making. I often say that it's old men who decide that we have to go to war, and it's young people that have to end up fighting those wars. And sometimes that's just it's a metaphorical war. Sometimes it's very much a reality. So that's what a lot of my writing is about. And I like to say that the through line that runs through all of my books is that I like to write stories of the revolutionary girl. Young women who are, like I said, finding their voices. Sometimes revolution can be loud. Sometimes it can be, marching in the streets, like what I see Gen Z for Change doing right now, what I saw the kids from Parkland doing, what I see little Miss Flint, who's been doing for literally years to try to get clean water, in Detroit, in Flint rather. And even like kids in my neighborhood who inspire me, like during the start of COVID and the pandemic, there was a huge mask shortage, especially in, our nursing homes. And that's some of our most vulnerable, fellow citizens. And a young person in my neighborhood, he was in middle school, decided that he was going to try to sew masks for the nursing homes. And he asked his mom to teach him how to sew, and he learned how to sew masks on the sewing machine. And then he got his friends involved. And these young people, they're 7th and 8th graders, made all these masks for a local nursing home. Now, is that a giant revolution? No, but is it an incredible revolutionary act that these young people did? Yes. And could it have made a difference in the lives of someone? Absolutely. So that's what I try to capture in my stories. The brilliance of teens. And, I hope that when adults come to my stories and read them, because YA is for everyone. My protagonists, of course, and young adult protagonists are teens. But, I so often get older people who say to me, like, I read young adult too. And I'm like, it's okay. You don't have to whisper it like you're taking drugs. But what I hope that adults get from my novels, if they're reading them, is just sort of almost a remembrance of what it means to be young, and like the power that young people have if we open up a little space for them in our world. As adults, I think that's a huge part of our responsibility. I feel like an ethical obligation to young people as an adult, and I want to give them that space to shine. So I think that's, I guess, a lot of why I write. So for Hollow Fires, I was inspired by a few different things. One is true crime. Like, I know true crime podcasts are hugely popular. I also love true crime podcasts, but in listening to some true crime, I guess it was raising a lot of these sort of ethical questions for me, like whose stories are told? What is the point of view from which those stories are being told? Why is it that we as a culture know the names of so many serial killers, but we don't know the names or the stories of the lives of their victims? Because all of those people were people who were loved and who had dreams, and, whose lives were cut short by hatred. And when I was listening to a lot of true crime podcasts, there's some podcasts that do a great job of that, but I also felt like I'm not getting enough of the story from the point of view of the families who have lost so much. And I also found that we don't hear the stories often of people of color who are victims. For example, there has been a rash of disappearances of Indigenous women, and we just don't hear about them throughout, like in North America, US and Canada. There is also an incredible number of Black trans women who have been murdered, and we don't really ever hear their stories. And we also know, just statistically, that crimes committed against white people are more likely to be solved than crimes committed against Black and Brown and Indigenous people. So those are things that I wanted to investigate. I also know that as a teacher, I remember talking to my students about the notions of truth, right? Because especially now, we are bombarded by media. And during the Trump administration, when we had this term alternative facts come to the fore, I was like, what is that? What are we even telling our young people? And so I just wanted to arm young people with the understanding that when they look at media, when they're absorbing media, they have to be asking those critical questions, like, what are the sources of this information? What is truth and fact, and what is alternative fact? And when does it serve people to lie or obfuscate fact? And so those were all things that kind of went into the story. And Hollow Fires is a story of a young woman who is trying to solve a crime. At first, a young boy, a Muslim Iraqi American whose family were refugees, goes missing, and no one seems that interested in what's happened to this boy, except Sophia, the protagonist of the story, who knows that this was a young person who deserved so much more than he's getting. What's happened to him. And then when he turns out to be murdered, again, it's a little bit of a flash on the pan. Like in media, we get a little bit of story about it, and then he's just easily forgotten. And Sophia wants to find justice for him. She doesn't want him to be forgotten, because he, like I said before, he was a young person who lived and who had dreams and passions and was loved, and he deserves to be remembered. And she wants to seek justice for him, even as she's questioning what it means what justice means for somebody who has been murdered and his family. So this novel is a dual POV. I remember how I said I felt like I want to hear more of the story of the victim. So in my novel, because I can do it in fiction, I actually give Jawa, the young boy who was murdered, a point of view. So we have a dual POV. Sophia, the young high school, she's the editor of her school newspaper, a young Muslim American girl who wants to find justice. We have Jawad's voice, which is essentially compelling Sophia to find him. And then there's also found documents. So one of the things that I was talking about, like when we're trying to understand truth and fact, and I was saying we're always we're bombarded with so much media now, I wanted to sort of have the reader experience a little bit of what the characters would experience, how they're getting all this information about who's going missing and who was murdered. And it's also, all those found documents are all, there are Reddit posts, there's tweets, there's blog posts from very right-wing media, there's transcripts from the news, there's podcast interviews. And I just wanted the reader to be able to sort of have the experience that the way the characters are having it. So this was a book that was like very near and dear to my heart. And it was also a little bit inspired by a crime that happened in 1924, the Leopold and Loeb murder. Which is something that I had studied in school, and which to me really resonated because there's so many questions and issues that arose in that trial and that crime that was nearly 100 years old that are still relevant to society today. We're already past the question point, so I'm sorry. Should I just read like 2 paragraphs really quick? Or do you want me to jump to, I'll just read, I'll read that.
That's fine.
So this is just from Sophia's point of view. It's just the very beginning of the novel. Because the novel begins sort of now and travels back into the past. Sophia, you never forget the first time you see a dead body. It was warmish for Chicago winter, if the temperature hovering around freezing is warm. In Chicago, it is. There was the sickly sweet rotting smell of leaves that had fallen from trees, mixing with mud, never totally drying up before the first snow. The odor filled the air around the sloping embankments of a crumbling stone culvert that was lined with steel. The pipe was hidden by overgrown limp grass, deep in Jackson Park, and the part where no one goes because there are stories of ghosts and Mothman sightings. It's not the restored part of the park, the blooming Japanese garden, the shiny metal sculpture of giant petals, the bike paths, and the Illinois prairie popping with blue cornflowers. It's the neglected area by the abandoned arched bridges that leads to nowhere. No one ever went there because there was absolutely nothing to see. Until the time there was. The first thing I saw was a shoe. And I think we can get to questions now. I saw somebody say something about the audiobook. Yes, the audiobook is fantastic. I really love my my voice actors for this. There's 2 different ones, and they're just amazing. Sunil and Ankani and Amin Al-Gamin. So just they're wonderful.
Thank you so much, Samira. Before we get to questions, I am going to speak on the behalf of the people that are here today with us and those that will be watching us that have worked with teens and young adults. I think your phrasing of that age being the realm of possibility is just absolutely heartwarming and amazing. And you put it into words what I think any teen librarian has tried to explain to those that don't work with teenagers, that like that is a different age group than children, and it is a different age group than adults. It is its own thing, and it is the realm of possibility. So I want to thank you for that. Moving on to the questions, starting with Hollow Fires. You touched on this while you were speaking about the book, but it really is told in 3 different perspectives, and I'm just wondering how did you write that? Because you have the main story is
right.
Satya, right? That's the main story, and then you have Jawad, who is speaking as a ghost of sorts, and then the little snippets from the news. So when you were writing, did you write it chronologically of how it's happening, or did you piece together and put in those news snippets and Jawad's, you know, his time in the novel afterwards, or, you know, how did you piece it together?
Yeah, this one, it was piece it together. Thank you so much, because piecing it together is exactly the right way, because it was like a puzzle. So I am a very linear writer. Like, I write from A to Z. I mean, I know there's every writer has a different style, but for me, I have to go from the front to the end. So I was writing like all those. So I'll write like the Sophia chapter, then I'll write the Jawad chapter, and then I'd write, you know, if I thought that was where I needed to insert a found document, or, you know, whatever the case may be. So I wrote it very linearly, but then during the revision process, I had to then like, okay, this needs to get cut, this needs to get moved over here. So I literally printed out the whole book. It's sort of a waste of paper, I'm sorry. But then I had it on my attic floor, you know, 400 pages or whatever it was. And I was literally, some of the pieces I was having to move and I would literally take a piece of paper like, oh, okay, this Reddit post should actually go over here. And I had to just be mindful of like because the chapters have to speak to each other, but we don't want like a spoiler, you know, and they also have to be, the chronology has to be right, because there is a little bit of a mishmash of chronology too that is occurring. And, you know, we see parts where time seems to be sped up and then where it's slowed down. So yeah, it was basically like a giant puzzle, literally just on my floor. And, you know, the hard thing about that is when you cut something, when you decide, okay, I don't want this chapter, then you have to figure out how cutting one person's point of view or one of those found document pieces is going to affect everything before and after, and then you have to revise accordingly. So it was a little bit of a challenge.
Well, like I said, it flows really well, even with the different times. You know, it starts in present day basically,
right,
and it backwards, and then it hops back to present day, but it flows extremely well.
Thank you.
And you did say this a little bit about how a lot of your books are a girl revolution, and I've noticed that because I've read all of your novels and your comics as well. But how important is it for you to have that narration coming from a female protagonist, but not just a female protagonist? Because in every book, they're strong in different ways, your female protagonists. It's not that, you know, in Hollow Fires, she's strong because she, you know, has some things happening with her personally, obviously, you know, with her family, but she's also taking on the task of solving this crime that nobody else seems to care about.
Right.
You know, so how important is it, and how do you figure out what ways to make your female protagonist strong?
So, you know, I think that, I mean, I think, I mean, I can't predict the future, but I'm guessing that all my protagonists will always be these sort of revolutionary girl characters. But it doesn't necessarily mean to me that they're only strong, because they all have vulnerabilities too. I mean, that's part of just being human, and I want my characters to be as three-dimensional as possible. So I also think, though, that having vulnerabilities or admitting when you're wrong or when you need help is actually part of strength. Like understanding the times where you need to lean on friends. And that's something that my characters sort of learn. Like, hey, I don't have to be sort of the lone wolf in this situation. And maybe I don't know everything. And maybe I need to help find, you know, maybe I need some help in certain areas. And that's why I always try to have like a friend group. And in all my books, or in most of my books, the parents are present. They have some kind of role. I know a lot of YA books, like there's missing parents. But for me, especially, like, look, I'm an immigrant, I'm Indian American Muslim. And, you know, my characters, many of them have similar sort of identities. and parents play a role in that immigrant life. So I wanted to have all those pieces because I feel like having that community is part of where my characters draw their strength. And also, you know, I talked about how I feel like young people at this age are just finding their politics and finding, you know, the truth of their voice. And I feel like that is really important for me to show. Like, I want my characters, I've met so many young people who are like this, like who have a strong sense of, you know, of what is right, of justice, who have important, you know, who want to push back against things that they see that are immoral or unethical that are happening in the world around them, or asking questions about it. Like, even questions like, well, how, you know, because Sophia, for example, goes to a, you know, a pretty fancy private school, but she's a scholarship student.
Mm-hmm.
So she, you know, she can ask questions about privilege and then challenge, you know, people around her about that. Like, is it fair or equitable that some kids get to have this incredible education and all these great resources while others have nothing comparatively? You know, even like the services that we have in our communities, like some communities are able to fund incredible libraries, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, for me, I talked about how much I love libraries because I think libraries are part of like our lighthouses in our democracy. And yet there's other communities that aren't able to have libraries funded via, you know, their town's budget, or because maybe their property values aren't the same, or what have you. So I love that my characters will ask questions like that, because I think young people, even at a much younger age than what I'm writing for, like I'm talking third graders, fourth graders, they understand when they have a sense of fairness. They understand when they see injustices, even if they don't have the full vocabulary for that. So for me, it's always important to write characters like that, because I think that's real, you know? I mean, yes, they also are like, who am I gonna go to prom with? Or, you know, like I have a crush on this person, or I don't, you know, there's all these things that are vying for their attention, but that's just part of teenage life. You know, there's a lot of things going on. So yeah, I think my characters can be strong and vulnerable at the same time. I think they can be thinking about, you know, their tennis match while at the same time they're thinking about, you know, the environment, or a murder, or justice, or what have you, because I think that teens, you know, they contain multitudes.
Yeah, they're not one dimensional. They're more
Right.
than. Oh, I appreciate that. And our last question, actually, you just touched on this a little bit, but somebody who is here with us today said that class distinction was so apparent in this novel, and the fact that the school was private and that Safia was on a full scholarship speaks to a lot of adolescents. I wondered about the principal of the school. I get that he has to cater to the wealthy alumni, but wouldn't he want to be more understanding of Sophia? He just seemed to be clueless and insensitive. I was so happy that Jawad at least had a teacher who understood and respected him, even though she couldn't save him. And I do like that she put in this distinction that Jawad did have an adult who was looking out for him, and something bad still happened to him.
Yeah, I mean, that's just reality, because that can happen. So
Yeah.
yes, the principal, I think he's actually more than clueless and insensitive. Like, to me, he's part of the villain, or one of the villains of the story. And I wrote him that way because of just, because of real life examples of adult leadership that has done that. This isn't a spoiler, but Jawad's story is partially based on the story of what happened to this young man, Ahmed Mohammed, who built a clock, or who like just, you know, who sort of tinkered with a clock, brought it to school, and then was handcuffed and taken out of school because the adult of the school thought it was a bomb. And he was perp walked out of the school, which to me was just absolutely incredible. He was found to have done no wrongdoing, yet the school still suspended him. He brought in this thing that he was excited about. Hey, I'm doing this STEM project. I'm excited about it. I want to show it to my teachers. And then he gets arrested, and the school still continued his suspension even after he was cleared of any wrongdoing. That to me was an example of adults, because that happened at the administrative level, of adults making really terrible, terrible choices. You know, there was this just happened. I was reading, oh gosh, now I can't remember I can't remember the state or the district where this happened, but a teacher was reading to very young people Sneetches, and there was an NPR story about economics, actually, and how you teach economics to very young people. You know, like these are kindergarten, first graders, I believe. And an admin who was in the room after one of the kids talked about how the Sneetch thing with the bellies and the stars, it seems it's unfair what's happening. And one child said it's sort of like what happened to Black people. It's like what was happening in society. So this was an observation a child made, and that administrator who was in the classroom stopped the teacher from continuing to read that book. I mean, so to me, I felt like this principle is based on so many real life examples of administrators who should be standing up more for their students and teachers and freedom to read and all of these things, but aren't. And so I also did want to have a positive example of teachers who can do great things. And Jawad's teacher, I mean, she tries so hard, and she also knows that the system is sort of, set up against her and also against him. But she does speak out, and she even talks about some of her regrets and not being able to do more. But I wanted to have that example of great teachers, because there are great teachers, and we even have an example.
You put in a perfect balance in there to show, and like you said, you had the representation of the parents that were involved in this story, and putting in those adults that were aware of what was happening versus those adults who just don't want to see it. They don't want to be part of it. They don't want to say it exists. But I want to thank you for this novel, for all of your novels. Like I said, I am a huge fan of your work, and I think that the things that you're bringing to light in your novels is so important for young people, but for adults as well. So I want to thank you, Samira. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Really, thank you to all the librarians. This really means so much to me. So thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Samira. Thank you, Alessandra. This was so great. I listened to the audiobook. It's available on Palace Project. Everyone just do it. You will feel lots of feelings, and they will be worth feeling.